Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to The Politics of Climate. This is a virtual presentation by Doug Nunn. This was recorded on October 12th, 2020, in the heat of the election campaign. My intention here is to talk a little bit about what Al Gore calls the "Will We Change" part of his major presentation for the Climate Reality Project. In this, Al Gore talks about three things. Must we change? Where he presents a preponderance of evidence that the climate has changed massively in the last couple of generations and is moving toward a hotter and hotter temperature. In the "Can we change" aspect of Al Gore's presentation, he talks about all the technological advances in alternative energy and all a variety of other things that have improved vastly in the last years that could move us towards an alternative energy future. In the "Will we change" part of his presentation, he begins to talk about how we can change and the politics of it. Well, this is often the part that is very difficult to talk about. The Climate Reality Project is a nonprofit corporation, a nonprofit entity, so they have trouble talking about the "will we change" aspect. I want to make sure that we talk about that, hence this slideshow, the politics of climate in this election season of 2020 with so much on the line. Ladies and gentlemen, let's begin. We know from the "Must we change" part of Al Gore's presentation that the largest source of global warming pollution has been the burning of fossil fuels since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution, of course, began back with James Watt's invention of the steam engine in the 1770s, but by the middle of the 19th century, there was a significant amount of industrialization both in Britain and in Europe, and of course in North America. This would increase vastly. As you can see, the global warming pollution is mainly effectively the result of fossil fuel burning. This has gone up drastically since World War II. Fossil fuels still provide 80% of the world's energy, and this has gone up dramatically since World War II. Be mindful that we are now spewing about 152 million tons of man-made global warming pollution into our thin shell of an atmosphere every 24 hours. Also, be mindful that when I was originally trained, this statistic was 110 million tons of global warming pollution. So, 2018, I was trained. In the 2.5 years since then, it's gone up by 42 million tons. Meanwhile, we see that since the Industrial Revolution and the invention of regular thermometers and the use of thermometers by nations around the world by the 1880s, the temperature of the global surface has continued to go up. You can note, please, that the world was actually quite a bit cooler at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century and into about the first quarter of the 20th century. But please note that the slope of this graph has gone up drastically since the 1930s and the 1940s. Now it's a preponderance of one-sided temperatures. The temperatures have gone way up since World War II. Please note also that there is a 72% chance that 2020 will be the new hottest year ever. We can see that there. Let's take a look at this bell-shaped graph. This is the famous bell curve that shows normal temperatures for the era when I was a young kid. This would be 1951 to 1980. I was born in 1952. This is what we expected. On the left are cooler than average temperatures as a number, and average temperatures in the middle, and warmer than average temperatures on the right. We will see this diverge from the mean, from the average bell curve, over the next decades. Between 1987 and 1997, please note that that baseline had moved to the right. There were less cooler than average temperatures, less average temperatures, way more warmer than average temperatures, and quite a few extremely hot recordings. Between 1998 and 2008, this bell curve had moved further to the right. So we see that the extremely hot temperatures are a larger portion and warmer than average are way up. And then in the last decade, it's gone even further up. It has moved completely out of the original bell curve from 1951 to 81. This particular graph shows you that temperatures around the world are going up. This is straightforward evidence. And please note also that the extreme temperature events that used to cover 0.1% of the total are now much larger. Let's note also that 19 of the 20 hottest years on record have occurred since the year 2001. 19 of the hottest years on record. I'm sorry, this particular animation doesn't have the exact 2018, 19, etc., but you get the idea. Note also that the hottest of all have been the last 5 years. We have seen this happen. We know it's happening. There have been a variety of weather events. Earlier in the year, we had the Australian bushfires, which were significant and burned more than ever before in Australia. Recently, of course, we've had the western wildfires in California, Oregon, Nevada, and the western United States. California, as of October, has seen more than 4 million acres burned so far this year. This is by far the record for California. I've been a Californian all my life, and this is indeed a sad event. And of course, the supposed lungs of the planet, the Amazon rainforest, continues to have way too many fires started by mineral prospectors and people clearing the land for cattle ranching, all aided by the present Bolsonaro government. And there's been an increase in tropical diseases on the move. This map gives you an idea of West Nile virus, Rift Valley fever, chikungunya, Chagas disease, dengue fever, Zika virus, etc. And of course, we all know from this year's springing of COVID-19 that there are a variety of viruses out there moving in our direction. This has all been improved drastically and sadly by climate change. So, when we look at the 10 key lines of evidence, we can see it here. They are all consistent with the climate change hypothesis. Humidity is up. Air temperature near the surface is up. Temperature over the oceans is up. Sea surface temperatures are up. Sea level temperatures are up. Ocean heat content is up. Temperature over land. And glaciers are melting, snow cover is down, and sea ice is down. These are major pieces of evidence of the climate change hypothesis. But we also know that there are possibilities out there in terms of our alternative energy. This is a fact. Enough solar energy reaches the Earth every hour to fill all the world's energy needs for a full year. So, if we can tap into this solar energy, we could power the Earth without having any need for fossil fuels. We would not need much of anything. The problem, of course, is storage, and of course, the problem is getting the solar energy and downloading it, basically. But it's there for the taking. The increase in solar energy use in the last years has been incredible. There are all kinds of investments in solar energy. This is booming. Meanwhile, we also know that globally, wind could supply worldwide electricity consumption 40 times over. Let's take a look at the American Midwest. The states from the Dakotas all the way down to Texas are in fact the windiest part of the world. These particular areas could supply the entire United States with power, the wind power from these areas. And I'm not just talking about politicians. Ted Cruz, his windiness has nothing to do with this. This is in fact tappable wind energy in the United States. So, in the last years, alternative energy has begun to surpass coal in the amount of energy provided to the network. So, we are seeing the improvement that goes on in alternative energy and the decrease of necessary use of fossil fuels. This is a trend that will continue. This is a market trend. This is straightforward. It's happening. But the amount of subsidy given to the fossil fuel industry still vastly outstrips the amount of subsidies and backing that is given to alternative energy. Right now, we know that the fossil fuel industry gets on the order of $5.2 trillion of support for in subsidies across the world. This compares with a vastly huge underfunded amount of alternative energy. So we see that the cost of carbon to our economy is immense. A lot of these are intangibles. A lot of these are subjective, but a lot of them are true. Take a look: species extinction, melting glaciers, and so forth. People think that may be off in the distance. I don't need to worry about that. But you do need to worry about water scarcity. You do need to worry about floods, hurricanes, wildfires, drought. All of this is happening. This is costing us money. If you don't believe it costs money, talk to the insurance industry. In North America, in the last 3 or 4 years, the insurance industry has lost hundreds of billions of dollars. They know they're in trouble. So this pushes the question, must we change? Can we change? Yes, we must change. Yes, we can change. And let's take a look at Guy McPherson. This is an environmentalist from Arizona. If you really think that the environment is less important than the economy, try holding your breath while you count your money. Thank you, Mr. McPherson. A very wise question. So then we come to Al Gore's question, Chapter 3, Will we change? And this is, in fact, the politics of climate. This is the political question. Will we change? Can we make the difference? And we know that over the years, the history of climate change debate has been one of massive denial. Here we have Tom Toll's cartoon. I believe this is from 2013. Tom Tolles is a cartoonist for the Washington Post. It's not real, it can't change. Well, there's economic consequences if we were to change. We don't want to have to, we can't do that. No, it's too late. These are the conclusions arrived at by people who have no imagination. We can meet these challenges. We are pushing in that direction with alternative energy, but it's not going to happen with the present situation, with the present politicians. So let's take a look now at some background to how we got to this place. Let's take a look first at the history of environmentalism of the 19th century and the move into conservation by both political parties in the United States at the beginning of the 20th century. One of the first great exponents of the realities of climate change was the brilliant scientist Alexander von Humboldt. If you ever have a chance to read The Invention of Nature, it's a biography of Humboldt I highly recommend. Humboldt talked about the realities of deforestation, the impact of ruthless irrigation, and he noted the masses of smoke and gas and great masses of steam over industrial areas in various industrial countries. He pointed out that this was leading to human-induced climate change and noted that by his incredible use of measuring. He was Mr. Thermometer, Alexander von Humboldt, and he toured the world actually looking at the variety of changes that had gone on in the climate. Henry David Thoreau, of course, famous as an abolitionist, he wrote On Civil Disobedience. He was also famous for his book On Walden Pond, where he wrote on natural history and he anticipated aspects of ecology and environmentalism. Thoreau also was an analyst of ecological patterns in fields and woodlots. For example, he wrote The Succession of Trees, where he showed experimentation and analysis to explain how forests regenerate after fire or human destruction, through the dispersal of seeds by winds and animals. Thoreau was a scientist and a philosopher. Then there was George Perkins Marsh, and he wrote in the 1860s. He talked about humans interfering with nature's rhythms, about farmers killing birds, which led to more insects, cause and effect. He talked about overgrazing with livestock, which led to droughts, cutting forests leading to climate change. And he pointed out, man is everywhere a disturbing agent. Wherever he plants his foot, the harmonies of nature are turned to discords. It was Marsh that pointed out that man had long forgotten that the earth was not given to him for his own consumption. And then there is perhaps the Babe Ruth of environmentalism, and that's John Muir. John Muir's family moved from Scotland to Wisconsin when he was an 11-year-old boy, and there he became absolutely fascinated by nature. He had an extraordinary mind, and he walked all over the United States. In fact, he walked single-handedly down to Florida as a young man. And he then came to California and began going regularly to the Sierra Nevadas, first as a shepherd and then as a naturalist. He wrote extensively on his experiences, and he developed an environmental philosophy. He also wrote in the style of maxims and aphorisms, which is most famously comes out in probably the essence of ecology. When we try to pick out anything by itself, we find it hitched to everything else in the universe. These are wonderful pieces of philosophy of environmentalism. By 1892, Muir combined with 182 like-minded members and started the Sierra Club to protect America's pristine forests and wild areas. This was a great beginning of an environmental group, and they have been powerful ever since. Let me take a moment to point out that recently this summer, the Sierra Club has come clean, as have many other people in the last years, about racist past of some of their philosophers. And this summer, the Sierra Club apologized for John Muir's racist legacy. If you've ever read My First Summer in the Sierra by John Muir, you'll note his sort of denigrated comments about Native Americans, and also his use of pejorative terms for Asians. He calls a Chinaman that travels with their group into the Sierras, etc. John Muir was definitely a creature of his time, and although a brilliant pioneer on environmental causes and ecology, he was also a person who was effectively a 19th century man when it came to racial ideas. So let's make sure we're crossing that notion and knowing that it was part of John Muir's legacy. Still, when it came to the environment, he was terrific. At the time, at the end of the 19th century, there was a battle going on within the environmental movement or the conservation movement of the time between preservationists and conservationists. John Muir was a preservationist. He believed that wilderness should be left untouched, that national parks should be built and left alone for the creatures and the vegetation involved. Meanwhile, the so-called wise use or conservationists believed that public land should be managed to provide resources. This is probably best represented by soon-to-be President Teddy Roosevelt and his soon-to-be Secretary of the Interior, Gifford Pinchot. These men believed that areas should be set aside, but there should be wise use of the resources. There should be conservation, but there should also be wise use of the resources. In 1901, Teddy Roosevelt came to power after the assassination of William McKinley. He would serve most of the next 8 years as President of the United States. During this time, Teddy Roosevelt and his so-called Square Deal, he worked to establish national parks. He established the United States Forest Service. He also worked on regulation. Part of the Square Deal was they put forth regulatory acts to change industry and make industry safer and more compliant with public health. This included the Pure Food and Drug Act, the Meat Inspection Act of 1906, and a variety of other relatively progressive pieces of legislation. He was a Republican. Teddy Roosevelt believed at the time that the environment was an asset. Then came one of the more spectacular moments of environmental history. This is when Teddy Roosevelt was making a tour around the United States, a whistle-stopping tour on a train, and he came to California in 1903 as part of this general tour. John Muir had invited him to meet, and they met in Yosemite. And Roosevelt and John Muir then went on a 3-night camping trip, basically a backpacking trip, and they went deep into Yosemite. And there they spent time conversing, philosophizing, and talking environmental conservation, for the next 3 days. They had minimal staff with them, a couple, 3 people to manage the horses, etc. It turned out to be a great nature conversation. Teddy Roosevelt mocked John Muir for not recognizing certain bird calls. Muir ridiculed Teddy Roosevelt for his adolescent love of shooting things and guns. But Muir was able to persuade Roosevelt to return Yosemite Valley and the Mariposa Grove to federal protection as part of the Yosemite National Park. When Roosevelt went back to Washington after this historic meeting, he turned around and nationalized various parts of federal land to add them to different national parks. This was one of the great moments of environmental history. And can you imagine it now? Can you imagine Donald Trump going backpacking with an environmentalist for 3 days? Or actually, any politician. It was an extraordinary moment in American environmental history. A generation passes. There isn't much movement on the environment, but there is basic consensus on the national park system. Franklin Roosevelt comes to power in 1933. And as part of his putting people back to work in terms of dealing with the Great Depression, part of it is the Civilian Conservation Corps, where they make a point of employing young men, that's obviously sexist at the time, but putting young men to work, building parks up, building bridges and campgrounds in parks, putting roads into parks, etc. It was originally for young men ages 18 to 25. It's eventually expanded to 17 to 28. And the Civilian Conservation Corps was designed to provide jobs for young men to relieve families who had difficulty finding jobs during the Great Depression. They had 300,000 people a year go through this program. 3 million young men eventually participated in the CCC, which provided them with shelter, clothing, and food, and a living wage. This was the ancestor of the Green New Deal. Roosevelt FDR acknowledged that a nation destroys its soil, destroys itself. Forests are the lungs of our land, purifying the air and giving fresh strength to the people. FDR was acknowledging the impact of conservation. Of course, there were some massive problems going on at the time. The Great Dust Bowl during the early 1930s, was a massive environmental disaster. This had been caused by plowing up soil in the prairie that was never meant to be plowed and leaving the topsoil exposed. Huge amounts of topsoil literally blew away. And this led, of course, to the massive migrations of people from Oklahoma, Kansas, northern Texas, and the like, to places like California. The Dust Bowl refugees came from this. But there was a lot of pragmatism about the environment. There had always been a practical bent to human thinking. Solar energy had been used since the beginning of time. And if you go back to look at pictures of 100 years ago, Pasadena, say Southern California in the 19-teens, you will see a lot of passive hot water solar collection. They had solar collectors on their roofs and they boiled their water that way. That was one way to get hot water. This, of course, disappeared over time, but that was part of the deal back then. During World War II, there was a lot of work on scrap metal drives, paper, rubber, and rag drives. They recycled a lot of things for the nation's well-being, to supply troops, etc. This recycling effort was part of commonsensical work to help the society. After World War II, the U.S. economy absolutely boomed. Americans achieved levels of prosperity they'd never known before. While other parts of the world struggled to rebuild from the devastation of World War II, citizens of the United States saw their standard of living surpass any previous generation. The economy grew by about 37% during the 1950s. At the end of the decade, the median American family had 30% more purchasing power than at the beginning. And if for those of you who have seen Robert Reich's Inequality for All, you know he called this a glorious time for relative social democracy. Think of the GI Bill. A lot of people made the middle class because the GI Bill gave returning veterans a chance to go to college, etc. My father went from a welder in 1948 when he got out of high school to after he got out of the Korean War, 6 years later, in 1954, he went to college, and when I was a kid, we made the middle class. This was huge. But there were consequences. The booming 1950s had environmental consequences. There was extraordinary air pollution, water pollution, etc. This is a picture of Los Angeles in the 1950s. That smoke that you see was completely unfiltered air pollution. This was due to the basin nature of Los Angeles and to the massive number of new cars. The result was a new bevy of environmentalists who came out and questioned the direction of the American economy. Soon after the war, the famous Aldo Leopold from Wisconsin wrote a Sand County Almanac, with positing the notion that humans are part of the environment, not its masters. Aldo Leopold's famous book led to an environmental movement, as did Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, which came out in 1962. Carson was a nature writer who basically did all kinds of work recording poisoning of birds and various species across the United States. And she then posited the notion that citizens have a right to be secure from poisons, something that she notioned should be part of the Bill of Rights. Further into the 60s, we had E.F. Schumacher, who wrote his book Small is Beautiful, where he argued for smaller, more sustainable economics and smaller factories, etc. It was sort of a social democracy on a smaller scale. At the end of the 60s, Stanford's Paul Ehrlich wrote The Population Bomb, where he warned of the dangers of overpopulation. By the end of the 1960s, the environmental movement had picked up momentum. In April of 1970, we had our first Earth Day. It was a massive success in the United States. I was a senior in high school as a 17-year-old. In that April 22nd, 1970, I walked the 3 miles to school. I was part of a huge movement of students. There were 3,000 students at my baby boom high school in Concord, California, and we all participated in Earth Day. It was terrific. 1970 also saw the establishment of the Environmental Protection Agency as part of the Environmental Protection Act. Philosophically, this was an era when people were dreaming about what avenues environmentalism could follow. Ernest Callenbach from the East Bay, from Berkeley, I believe, wrote the many-famous novel Ecotopia, which is a short look at a wonderland of Oregon, Washington, and Northern California, where an ecotopian wonderland is founded. And he talks about a journalist who goes back to Ecotopia for the first time in a generation and reports back to the United States. Fascinating book if you haven't read it. I highly recommend it. So let's look at this Republican, Richard Nixon. And he signed some of the most important environmental legislation of all time in 1970 to 1973 and 74. Nixon signed the Environmental Protection Act in 1970. This established the EPA. Nixon also signed the Clean Air Act of 1970 and the Clean Water Act of 1972. These are arguably some of the greatest pieces of environmental legislation of all time, signed by a Republican, and they became part of our environmental laws. I don't say that Richard Nixon was the greatest environmentalist of all time, but he was there and he signed these pieces of legislation. He was a Republican. Please note that at the time, being a Republican did not mean you were against the environment, did not mean you were against strictures on the economy. It meant there was a consensus in the United States across bipartisan lines. In 1973, he signed the Endangered Species Act, which basically protected all kinds of endangered species across the country. This was also a major piece of legislation. This was under constant challenge by corporations and their legal supporters and has been ever since. And then, with all this environmental legislation going on, we take a look at some economic jolts that came into play. In the Arab-Israeli War of the fall of 1973, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, suddenly put an embargo on Western economies, European and United States and Canada, and basically restricted oil exports to these countries. This caused major economic disruption and led to long gas lines in the United States and Europe, to rationed heat in Europe. I was an exchange student in Ireland in 1973, 74. And during that particular time, I remember we only were allowed to have heat 3 hours a day, 2 hours in the morning and 1 hour in the evening before bed. This was the kind of strictures that were going on. The response of Congress was to build in the corporate automobile fuel efficiency standards, also known as CAFE standards, to push the miles per gallon up on cars and trucks so as not to waste gas and oil. This was a movement that has been going on since, try to get more efficiency, fuel efficiency for cars. The CAFE standards have been part of law ever since, although at various times they've been pushed back. Another jolt to the energy economy was 3 Mile Island, which was a nuclear accident in Pennsylvania, which happened in 1979. There was a near meltdown at a large nuclear plant in Pennsylvania. This caused a week of major hand-wringing in the United States, where it was worried that this would lead to something even worse, to lead to a worse meltdown. It actually was kept under control, but it was a scary time, and it made people nervous about nuclear energy. Even worse was the Chernobyl meltdown in 1986 in the Ukraine. There were 4 reactors in Chernobyl, and there was a neighboring city called Pripyat in the Ukraine. One of the 4 reactors, after some experimentation by some of the engineers, the top was blown off the reactor, and huge amounts of nuclear waste were spewing into the atmosphere. Proving once again that nuclear energy is a very dangerous way to boil water. Vast areas of the Ukraine were made uninhabitable. To this day, there is an exclusion zone of 1,000 square miles around this area. Pripyat, the neighboring town, was completely evacuated. Dozens and dozens of people died trying to control the fire and the explosion, and multiple thousands of people came down with cancers of various kinds in the surrounding areas. The Europeans didn't discover this until some time later. It was quite an extraordinary mess. Meanwhile, unbeknownst to the public, in the late 1970s, oil companies like Exxon and Shell were carrying out internal assessments of the damage that could be done by carbon dioxide released by fossil fuels, and they were forecasting the planetary consequences of these emissions. In 1982, for example, Exxon predicted that by about 2060, the year 2060, CO2 levels would reach around 560 parts per million, double the pre-industrial level, and that this would push the planet's average temperatures up by about 2 degrees Celsius over the current levels then. This is information that Exxon and Shell kept secret from the public, and the Reagan administration would join in this denial. Exxon had spent millions of dollars researching the problem. They outfitted an oil tanker, the SO Atlantic, with CO2 detectors to measure how fast the oceans could absorb excess carbon, and hired mathematicians to build sophisticated climate models. By 1982, Exxon had concluded that even the company's earlier estimates were probably too low. In a private corporate primer, they wrote that heading off global warming and potentially catastrophic events would require major reductions in fossil fuel combustion. Politically, in 1980, there was a big election. Jimmy Carter lost to Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan was governor of California. He had a decidedly mixed record of environmental ups and downs. He talked about out of 2 sides of his mouth, effectively. We see here 2 classic Reagan quotes. Preservation of our environment is not a liberal or conservative challenge, it's common sense. But on the other side, environmental extremists wouldn't let you build a house unless it looked like a bird's nest. And of course, the very famous, once you've seen one redwood, you've seen them all. Reagan was a decidedly mixed bag. But when he came to power, he did some things that turned out to be rather significant. Jimmy Carter had put solar panels on the roof in the last part of his days in power in the late 1970s. He was in power from 77 to 81. He had put solar panels on the roof as a gesture towards energy independence. And when Reagan came down, the very first week he came into power in 1981, he had those solar panels taken off the roof. He also defunded solar energy research. He considered closing the Energy Department, and he expanded coal mining on federal lands. This was the beginning of an era of making use of federal lands under conservative administrations. His Secretary of the Interior was James Watt, and James Watt was perceived as being hostile to environmentalism, and he endorsed development of federal lands by foresting and ranching and other commercial interests. This was also part of the Reagan ethos at the time. Parenthetically, Watt had the record among those who served as Secretary of the Interior of listing the fewest species ever protected under the Endangered Species Act. But toward the end of Reagan's time in office, there was increasing evidence that there was climate change. In 1988, in a hearing that was chaired by, at the time, Senator Al Gore from Tennessee, James Hansen of NASA testified on climate change before a congressional committee. This was a very hot week, and he stated with high confidence that long-term warming was underway and severe warming was likely in the next 50 years. Warming that would lead to storms and floods and environmental damage. Suddenly, we had a world recognition across the planet that things were changing. And in 1992, there was a Rio Earth Summit. Rio de Janeiro had an Earth Summit that took place as planetary consensus of the problem was coming together. It was not especially wanted during the George H.W. Bush administration. They tried to censor scientific conclusion of NASA and NOAA climate scientists. And Bush never really took a vigorous interest in global warming. This negligence allowed his chief of staff, John Sununu, to control the administration's climate policy. Sununu is probably the closest thing this story has to a villain. He actually prevented William Riley, Bush's EPA administrator, from negotiating a UN treaty that meaningfully limited greenhouse gas emissions. So, 5 years later, they had the Kyoto Protocol, and this was a group of nations that got together to sign the next level of climate relief. And the Kyoto Protocol basically acknowledged that individual countries have different capabilities in combating climate change, owing to economic development, and therefore this puts an obligation to reduce current emissions on developed countries on the basis that they are historically more responsible for current levels of greenhouse gases. Well, the United States was one of the many nations that actually signed this during Clinton's presidency, but it's the only signatory that has never ratified the protocol. At the time, the United States accounted for about 35% of global emissions in the mid-90s. This is much less now. But the United States would not acknowledge its situation, at least in terms of passing this as legislation. So the Kyoto Protocol was one of these things where people got excited about it. In Kyoto, there's an eyewitness, let me read you this. Developed nations had reached a tentative accord on climate change. An eyewitness tells us exhausted delegates lay slumped on couches in the corridor or on the floor in their suits, but most of them were grinning. Imperfect and limited though the agreement was, it seemed that momentum had gathered behind fighting climate change. But as I watched the delegates cheering and clapping, an American lobbyist who had been coordinating much of the opposition to the accord, turned to me and said, "I can't wait to get back to Washington, where we've got this thing under control." He was right. The GOP-controlled Senate passed the Byrd-Hagel resolution in 1997 by a 95-0 vote. The Byrd-Hagel resolution was a rejection of Rio and Kyoto and resolved that the U.S. should not be a signatory to any protocol that mandated the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, unless it also required reductions from developed countries during the same time period. This was, in fact, a bipartisan rejection of our obligations to the planet. 2001 to 2009, George W. Bush was president, and the U.S. effectively ignored climate politics. In March 2001, the Bush administration announced that it would not implement the Kyoto Protocol, claiming the treaty would create economic setbacks in the U.S., and did not put enough pressure to limit emissions from developing nations. Later on during the administration, the Bush administration thanked Exxon executives for the company's active involvement in helping determining climate change policy. At this point, Bush was admitting that they had a political clientele that did not want to be regulated. In 2008, John McCain ran for the Republican Party as a climate change realist, much like Barack Obama at the time. McCain had written climate change legislation that had failed. He had worked on bipartisan coalitions that crumbled. But when Congress came closest to passing a bill that embraced market-based cap and trade, McCain turned his back. But his party, the Republicans, had already run from him. The Republican Party's fast journey from debating how to combat human-caused climate change to arguing that it did not exist is a story of big political money, Democrats sitting on their hands, and a developing partisan chasm that grew over the years like a crack in the Antarctic ice shelf. This was buttressed by the Koch brothers, who spent vast sums of money, literally hundreds of millions of dollars, pushing doubt on climate change. The Koch brothers were libertarian, energy and industrialists, and they went to work putting hundreds of millions of dollars behind Republican and Libertarian candidates to support their fossil fuel agenda. The influential network of policy and political groups backed by them had grown tenfold in these years, and they basically pumped money in. By 2018, they were pumping more hundreds of millions of dollars in. In 2015, Senator James Inhofe from Oklahoma famously brought a snowball to the floor of the Senate to disprove global warming. Inhofe is also the author of a book called Hoax, supposedly disproving climate change. At this point, the Republican Party had solidified as the climate denialist party. There had been different policies put forward during this time period, during the early years of the Obama administration. Some Republicans had continued to back cap and trade. Cap and trade is a system designed to reduce pollution in our atmosphere. There is a cap put on greenhouse gas emissions that drive global warming. The cap gets stricter and more limited over time. The trade part is a market for companies to buy and sell allowances that let them emit only a certain amount as supply and demand set the price. Companies trade back and forth, and there's a strong incentive to save money by cutting emissions in the most cost-effective ways. So if you're a big emitter, you can buy credits back from people who are below the emission line, and then the overall market gets cut back over time. This, in theory, helps cut back on pollution. And then there's carbon taxes, various ones around the world. This is one that is graphics that's shown from Singapore. There's all around the world this is done. Carbon taxes are basically put in place to stop companies from overdoing the amount of polluting that they're putting in the atmosphere. They want to price the negative externalities of burning fossil fuels. The program would redistribute money raised from fossil fuel companies to low-income households and could be a useful way to bring down carbon being pumped into the atmosphere. I must note that in November 2018, there was a carbon tax initiative on the Washington state ballot that was defeated 56 to 43%. However, fossil fuel industries spent $35 million in an effort to defeat it. And so, Barack Obama came to power in 2009. By 2012, he had lost Congress, and he was working with a contrary House of Reps and Senate. This meant that Obama's environmental actions were executive actions, things he would do and he could put in place, but the next president could undo. In 2012, he raised the corporate automobile fuel efficiency standards meant for 2025 to be raised to 54.5 miles per gallon. This was a major step, and a lot of people were skeptical. We'll talk momentarily. He managed to get the EPA labs to prove that it was possible. Then in 2015, he had in place the so-called Clean Power Plan. This was a variety of actions to limit industry pollution so that we could work together with the rest of the world for what became the Paris Climate Accords. This was a massive world summit that came together in Paris in 2015, where all the nations of the world at the time, with just a few exceptions, signed the Paris Climate Accords so that we could work together to limit carbon in the atmosphere and to work towards limiting the temperature increase over time of the world. This was a major step. At the time, I believe Iran, Iraq, very few exceptions were outside of this climate accord. This was a big deal. Meanwhile, Obama's EPA had proven that the CAFE standard of 54.5 miles per gallon could be achieved by 2025. They did this at the EPA labs in Ann Arbor, Michigan. This was a major possible positive move, and it's something that has forced the American automobile industry to push towards less pollution. It was a big deal. So, at the end of 2015, almost every country in the world had agreed to work together to achieve net zero greenhouse emissions. This is a planetary involvement. This was a big deal. And we see that had we achieved this, by 2025, if we had achieved 54.5 miles per gallon, for example, with the CAFE standard, consumers would have saved $1.7 trillion at the pump over the life of the program. A family that purchased a car in 2025 would save $8,200 in fuel costs over that time. Meanwhile, the American economy would save 12 billion barrels of oil and eliminate 6 billion metric tons of carbon dioxide pollution. These were the possibilities at the time. And then the election of 2016 came. The United States elected a president, the Electoral College system of government in the United States put into power a man who had tweeted climate change skepticism at the time at least 115 times. Typically, the concept of global warming was created by and for the Chinese in order to make U.S. manufacturing non-competitive. With climate change one of the only existential threats this planet faces, we had elected a president who would actively work to make it worse. And in charge of the Senate of the United States, that archaic institution, we had a man, Mitch McConnell, who said this: "If I'm still majority leader of the Senate after next year, none of these things are going to pass the Senate. They won't even be voted on. So think of me as the Grim Reaper. None of that stuff is going to pass. None of it." So let's be mindful that this man, who has never gotten a vote outside the state of Kentucky, is working to implement policies and put judges in courts to make people live his dream of forcing the Jim Crow Kentucky of his youth on the rest of us for the next 3 generations. Not a great moment for the environment. So let's look at what the EPA had been putting out in 2016. Very matter-of-fact, objective notions. This is a typical warning. Runoff and flooding resulting from increases in extreme precipitation, hurricane rainfall, and storm surge will increasingly contaminate our water sources. This is the United States EPA 2016. Let's take a look at what happens in 2017. This is when Donald Trump takes over and Scott Pruitt becomes his EPA administrator. Please note this one line. We are currently updating our website to reflect EPA's priorities under the leadership of President Trump and Administrator Pruitt. Well, this is not updating it to reflect current science. This is to reflect EPA's political priorities under the leadership of President Trump. It does not have anything to do with environmental realities. The Trump administration was hardening its case on climate science. It was working against the science, and this has made an enormous difference in the last years. This is typical at the time. If you look at it, it's developing a laissez-faire, non-scientific attitude, spurning scientific method, evidence, and corroboration. EPA scientists were being forced out over time in a big way. So what in the United States, what are the differences, and how do people actually what do people actually believe about climate change? Let's take a look here. We see here that about 2/3 of Americans believe in reducing the effects of global climate change, protecting air quality, protecting water quality, etc. But we also see right here, if you take a look, that those in the Democratic Party are around 90% likely. Meanwhile, the Republican Party in the high 30s. This varies across the various age groups of the Republican Party. So there is a difference, in vast differences, in fact, between political groups on climate change and environmental issues. Why do people doubt science? What's the big deal? Well, what are they so afraid of? We know that 95% plus, around 97%, they often say, of active climate scientists attribute global warming to human causes. But as we saw, only 2/3 of U.S. adults believe this, if you can believe science. So do I believe in gravity? Yes, but I don't have any choice. The apple will fall on my head. It's scientific reality. So this is what we have. Why? There's misinformation, poor education, peer pressure, tribal membership. I don't agree with it, neither do I. Distaste for the implications, religious contradictions, and we've got the media imposition of false balance. But the reality is that scientists are the ultimate skeptics. Peer review process is tough. When you have to go to a peer review process and be battered by a bunch of other scientists or a double-blind study, these things are proven. Meanwhile, arguments are mischaracterized over time. There's a variety of different ways of making that look bad. There are partial truths, false dichotomies, red herrings, a variety of these things. You don't need to go to the party. You need to go to the party with me. Otherwise, you'll just be bored at home. Here, the speaker suggests that the only other possibility besides being at the party is being bored at home. These are false dichotomies. Let's look at a typical cherry-picked argument. The climate has cooled in every decade since 1973. If you said this, you would be right. It's gone up and down, as we can see by this evidence. But notice the slope of the graph. The slope of the graph is in one direction. Global land temperatures have gone up since the mid-70s. This is the reality. You can cherry-pick, but you'd be wrong. Meanwhile, scientific policies, advisory boards were being packed. The EPA is being purged of scientists who don't agree with things. Bullying of scientists, selective funding or defunding. So let's take a look at the reality here. This is a notion, I love this. This is from my friend Evan Mills from Lawrence Labs in Berkeley. Positive proof of global warming. by underwear changes. We see the 18th century, the bloomer has changed into contemporary bikini underwear. But this is not proof of global warming. This is change of fashion. But it just so happens to coincide with the reality. So in this difficult time, into this post-2017 environment, we see that states were stepping forward to do something about it. Here's Jerry Brown just before he left office. He left office in, I believe, 2019. If the president is going to be AWOL in this profoundly important human endeavor, then California and other states will step up. California has been stepping up, and other states have been stepping up with it here in the United States. Countries around the planet are working in the direction of dealing with climate change. We as individuals are working to do things that we can make a difference. We're recycling, we're eating less meat, we're carpooling, we're composting, we're not wasting food, we're limiting travel. We're joining environmental groups, the Sierra Club, the NRDC, Greenpeace, the Nature Conservancy, the Environmental Defense Fund, and we're standing up for a variety of different movements, pieces of legislation, international organizations, the Paris Climate Accord, the EPA, the Clean Power Plan. Our federal government is absent. Meanwhile, there's also lawsuits that threaten a different thing. This is, in fact, a very important one. It's been put on hold lately, but I thought it had promise. This is Juliana versus the United States. This lawsuit was by a group of young people, I think 15 to 25 at the time when it came out. This lawsuit asserts that the government violated the youth's rights by encouraging and allowing activities that significantly harmed their right to life and liberty, and sought the government to adapt methods for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. The lawsuit is at the leading edge of an area of environmental law referred to as atmospheric trust litigation, a concept based on the public trust doctrine and international responsibility related to the government's control over natural resources in the interest of public benefit. Unfortunately, in January of this year, a Ninth Circuit panel reversed the judge who had ruled in their favor and dismissed the case on the grounds that the plaintiff lacks standing to sue. Attorneys for the youthful plaintiffs have appealed the dismissal. It still looks difficult. So what do we need to do? The fact is, we need to mobilize not only nationally, but internationally. We need to work with other nations. This is not a time for nationalism. So when we hear the notion that Make America Great Again is the way to go, let us remember the words of Samuel Johnson and Winston Churchill, rehashed. Nationalism is the last refuge of scoundrels. We don't need a great nation, we need a great planet. And let's always remember the words of G.K. Chesterton in regard to nationalism. My country, right or wrong, is like saying my mother, drunk or sober. Think about it. This international movement is being led by people all over the planet. We've all heard of Greta Thunberg and her international student strikes. There are a variety of these going on across the world. The Extinction Rebellion started in Britain a couple of years ago, and this is also moving around the world. It's a global environmental movement with the stated aim of using nonviolent civil disobedience to compel governmental action to avoid tipping points in the climate system, to avoid biodiversity loss, and the risk of ecological collapse. So, in the United States, at the beginning of 2019, the new Congress came in. The House of Reps included a star by the name of Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez. And she put together, with Senator Edward Markey from Massachusetts, the aspirational Green New Deal, which is a variety of ideas to help make the economy more green and to push it in the direction of going forward with the Paris Climate Accords. There have been a variety of meetings across the country to Green New Deal town halls, sponsored by, among others, the Sunrise Movement. This has sprung up around the country, working to hammer out specifics. They've put out position papers and a variety of other things. I've attended a few of these myself and actually spoke at some. What is the Green New Deal? What are these aspirations? A 45% cut in carbon emissions by 2030 could keep global warming down to 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit. 100% of the nation's power demand should be met by renewables by 2030. And 10 million new green jobs could be added in the first 10 years. These are some main points of the Green New Deal. In the next few slides, I want to talk to you about renewable energy. They want to meet 100% of the power demand in the U.S. through clean, renewable energy and zero-emission energy sources. Develop a smart grid. A smart grid upgrades to better energy efficiency and distribution. Energy efficiency in upgrading our houses and our buildings, insulating them, overhauling transportation systems in the United States to eliminate pollution and greenhouse gas emissions. There's also low-tech solutions, removing greenhouse gases from the atmosphere and reducing pollution, including by restoring natural ecosystems through proven low-tech solutions that will increase soil carbon storage and preservation and afforestation. Working with dairy farmers to bring down the number of cows on farms. Cows, of course, being a major methane polluter. In fact, there's one stat that always blows me out, and that is if cows were a country, they'd be the third biggest methane polluter. That's amazing, after United States and China, after China and the United States. Guaranteed job, leave, vacation, and retirement, labor laws, public ownership, providing higher education. As you can see, the Green New Deal becomes the social democratic Green New Deal after a while. And some people are not inclined to support these parts of it. I think it's a wonderful thing. Perhaps you don't. But the idea of having green and social democracy together is the aspirations that the Green New Deal has. So by the time that Democratic candidates were running for president at the end of 2019 and beginning to debate, there were the help of the Green New Deal, the emphasis of the Green New Deal had in fact influenced various candidates, and they were pushed in the direction of having better climate policies. The three people with the strongest and greenest and most sustainable platforms received what so-called SEAL awards. This ended up being Jay Inslee, governor of Washington, Bernie Sanders, a senator from Vermont, and Elizabeth Warren, a senator from Massachusetts. They were awarded these awards for the strongest green platforms. Jay Inslee had a giant decarbonization plan. He's been out of the campaign now for about a year, but he had 5 detailed parts: 100% clean energy for America, an evergreen economy plan to spend $9 trillion in 10 years, a global climate mobilization plan to restore U.S. leadership around the world, freedom from fossil fuels, a variety of things. Inslee was incredibly green and would in fact be a great new head of the EPA, just saying. Bernie Sanders also talked about needing a president who understood that climate change is real and an existential threat to our country and the entire planet. He talked about massive job creation by transforming our energy system away from fossil fuels. Talked about building high-speed passenger rail, electric vehicles, and public transit. The same for Elizabeth Warren, who had a green industrial mobilization plan centering on government procurement of low-carbon technology, a green Apollo program to invest in energy research. These candidates were strong on the environment, and they influenced Joe Biden, who is presently, as you know, the Democratic Party's nominee for president. He's been pushed heavily by Sanders, Warren, Inslee, and others, but he's made tackling climate change a centerpiece of his campaign. And this has changed a lot. As you can see, here's some of the basics. He's talking about a massive green jobs program to build renewable energy infrastructure, and energy efficiency upgrades, the construction of 500,000 electric vehicle charging stations, greatly increasing the share of renewable energy from wind, solar, and other technologies, and the idea of ending the use of fossil fuels to generate electricity by 2035. Biden has been pushed in a direction that is highly different from what he originally had. He's also vowed to rejoin the Paris Climate Accord the moment he came into office. These are major improvements on what Biden was doing before, and they also indicate a Democratic Party that has become strongly green. A weakness is that Joe Biden is also talking about continuing fracking for the moment. He's talked about hydraulic fracking continuing. With it in mind, fracking has to continue because we need it as we need natural gas as a transition energy. This, of course, is open to debate, but it is interesting to see that this is something that doesn't make him exactly as strong as he could be. Meanwhile, what was the Republican response in Congress? They, of course, have poo-pooed the idea of a Green New Deal. But to his credit, Senator Lamar Alexandra, who will soon be retiring, he proposed a Manhattan Project on clean energy back in response to the Green New Deal. He came up with a set of 10 grand challenges, and this proposal would have created a green energy dream that included greener buildings, cheaper solar power, and the capturing of carbon that would harness CO2 emissions produced by using fossil fuels for electricity generation and industrial processes. He had a 5-year alternative plan that looked to boost production of electric vehicles, lower the cost of solar energy, and to construct more advanced nuclear reactors. Okay, now that's a different point. No problem, but no real support in the GOP. Only Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski from Alaska showed some interest. He got almost nowhere. Meanwhile, the President of the United States shows almost no difference from his ideas of 2016. He has alternated between calling climate change a hoax and sort of acknowledging that it might exist. He says he's an environmental champion for whom the environment is very important, yet he attacks energy-efficient light bulbs, talks about windmills causing cancer, and aggressively promotes policies that would allow more planet-warming pollution. Effectively, these are some of the actions that he had done. So actions speak louder than words. Soon after taking office, Trump announced the U.S. withdrawal from the Paris Agreement on Climate, in which nearly 200 countries had signed. The U.S. withdrawal is set to take effect the day after our election, after the November election. On November 4th, we would be withdrawing from the Paris Climate Accord. He's directed his EPA to rescind the Obama-era Clean Power Plan, a regulation that would have required states to move away from coal-based power plants. His budgets have repeatedly tried to slash the EPA by nearly a third. He has spearheaded a broad reduction in environmental regulation, rolling back nearly 80 separate EPA regulations. These include requirements to reduce methane emissions, factor carbon emissions into federal decision-making, and limit pollutants from fracking. He has sought to open nearly all U.S. waters and protected lands to oil and gas drilling, with the exception of near Florida, which of course is important for his campaign. So there's a variety of things. He has weakened industry-wide automobile fuel efficiency standards implemented under President Obama. The amount of environmental damage that the Trump administration has done has been extraordinary. So, as part of my job, I don't tell you who to vote for, but I do tell you that I am a partisan for the environment. And as a partisan for the environment, let us say that we must practice some wisdom. This is a slide given to me by my friend Evan Mills from the Lawrence Labs, and this shows the essence of what we're dealing with as we come to make these decisions. This is ostensibly from a Chinese proverb. When the winds of change blow, some build walls, others build windmills. Let us remember in this time of the election of 2020 to show wisdom in our election choices, in our voting choices, when we climb in the booth or when we sign that ballot to be sent in. Let us remember we must be wise in our choices. We have seen all kinds of bipartisan consensus thrown under the bus in the last 20, 25 years. We have obligations to move forward. And as we finish this particular slideshow on the politics of climate, I would like to end with a production put out by The Intercept and Naomi Klein. This is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's Message from the Future, decorated beautifully by artist Molly Crabapple, who does the illustrating. This is a 7-minute video with which I would like to close this presentation on the politics of climate. It's called A Message from the Future.
The bullet train from New York to DC. It always brings me back to when I first started making this commute. In 2019, I was a freshman in the most diverse Congress in history. Up to that point, it was a critical time. I'll never forget the children in our community. They were so inspired to see this new class of politicians who reflected them, navigating the halls of power. It's often said, you can't be what you can't see. And for the first time, they saw themselves. I think there was something similar with the Green New Deal. We knew that we needed to save the planet and that we had all the technology to do it, but people were scared. They said it was too big, too fast, not practical. I think that's because they just couldn't picture it yet. Anyways, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's start with how we got here. 1977, New York. A senior scientist named James Black made a presentation about how burning fossil fuels could eventually lead to global temperatures rising 4 or 5 degrees Fahrenheit. Within 2 years, one of the world's biggest supertankers was outfitted with a state-of-the-art lab to measure CO2 in the ocean, gathering more data about global warming. Guess who was doing all of this research? ExxonMobil, the oil and gas company. Oh yeah, Exxon knew this whole time, as did our politicians. 10 years later, James Hansen, NASA's top climate scientist, told Congress he was 99% certain that global warming was happening and caused by humans. That was 1988, the year before I was even born. So did Exxon listen to the science, including their own? Did they change business models, invest in renewables? No, the opposite. They knew and they doubled down. They and others spent millions setting up a network of lobby groups and think tanks to create doubt and denial about climate change. It was an effort designed to attack and dispute the very kind of science they themselves had been doing. And it worked. Politicians went to bat for fossil fuels, and these massive corporations kept digging and mining, drilling and fracking like there was no tomorrow. America became the biggest producer and consumer of oil in the world. Fossil fuel companies made hundreds of billions, while the public paid the lion's share to clean up their disasters. We lost a generation of time we'll never get back. Entire species will never get back. Natural wonders gone forever. And in 2017, Hurricane Maria destroyed the place where my family was from, Puerto Rico. It was like a climate bomb. It took as many American lives as 9/11. And in the next year, when I was elected to Congress, the world's leading climate scientists declared another emergency. They told us that we had 12 years left to cut our emissions in half, or hundreds of millions of people would be more likely to face food and water shortages, poverty, and death. 12 years to change everything. How we got around, how we fed ourselves, how we made our stuff, how we lived and worked, everything. The only way to do it was to transform our economy, which we already knew was broken, since the vast majority of wealth was going to just a small handful of people, and most folks were falling further and further behind. It was a true turning point. Lots of people gave up. They said we were doomed. But some of us remembered that as a nation, we'd been in peril before. The Great Depression, World War II. We knew from our history how to pull together to overcome impossible odds. And at the very least, we owed it to our children to try. The wave began when Democrats took back the House in 2018, and then the Senate and the White House in 2020, and launched the decade of the Green New Deal, a flurry of legislation that kicked off our social and ecological transformation to save the planet. It was the kind of swing-for-the-fence ambition we needed Finally, we were entertaining solutions on the scale of the crises we faced without leaving anyone behind. That included Medicare for All, the most popular social program in American history. We also introduced the federal jobs guarantee, a public option including dignified living wages for work. Funnily enough, the biggest problem in those early years was a labor shortage. We were building a national smart grid, retrofitting every building in America, putting trains like this one all across the country. We needed more workers. That group of kids from my neighborhood were right in the middle of it all, especially this one girl, Ileana. Her first job out of college was with AmeriCorps Climate, restoring wetlands and bayous in coastal Louisiana. Most of her friends were in her union, including some oil workers in transition. They took apart old pipelines and got to work planting mangroves with the same salary and benefits. Of course, when it came to healing the land, we had huge gaps in our knowledge. Luckily, indigenous communities offered generational expertise to help guide the way. Ileana got restless, tried her hand as a solar plant engineer for a while, but eventually made her career in raising the next generation as part of the Universal Child Care Initiative. As it turns out, caring for others is valuable, low-carbon work, and we started paying real money to folks like teachers, domestic workers, and home health aides. Those were years of massive change, and not all of it was good. When Hurricane Sheldon hit southern Florida, parts of Miami went underwater for the last time. But as we battled the floods, fires, and droughts, we knew how lucky we were to have started acting when we did. And we didn't just change the infrastructure, we changed how we did things. We became a society that was not only modern and wealthy, but dignified and humane too. By committing to universal rights like healthcare and meaningful work for all, we stopped being so scared of the future. We stopped being scared of each other, and we found our shared purpose. Ileana heard the call too, and in 2028, she ran for office in the first cycle of publicly funded election campaigns. And now she occupies the seat that I once held. I couldn't be more proud of her, a true child of the Green New Deal. When I think back to my first term in Congress, riding that old school Amtrak in 2019, all of this was still ahead of us. And the first big step was just closing our eyes and imagining it. We can be whatever we have the courage to see.